Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest on our show. Through this podcast, I really wanted to create a kinder and more empathetic version of the internet where we hold space for each other. And in the long run, we slowly start to develop an appreciation for the years of sacrifice, effort, learning, and love that it really takes to build a career in any field. So today I'm really excited to interview and talk to someone whose writing I've really been inspired by and I've found a lot of joy from. So a little bit about Eshna before we jump into this conversation. So for Eshna, dance is her first love and everything else comes secondary. She has been training in two forms of Indian classical dance, Odissi and Kathak, for the last 17 years. She works as a freelance writer and video editor by day and a dance teacher and practitioner by night. Her formal training is in filmmaking, and her Substack, The Deep Cut, which I will be including in the show notes, is a place where she combines her two loves of film and dance. The platform is a space where she analyzes, critically appreciates, and fangirls over dance on screen. This year, her obsession with dance becomes official as she prepares to do her master's in the field of dance research. She hopes that through her research and her physical practice, she can explore how dance can create meaning off the stage and how the form can be a space where all man made boundaries can come to rest. So, sorry. Okay. Thank you so much for making time for this. I'm so excited to talk to you. And today's conversation is really going to be about dance and your journey in dance. But I wanted to start this conversation with by asking you, what are your earliest memories of dance growing up?
Firstly, thank you. Thank you so much for number one, reading the stuff that I've been writing and also reaching out to me for this. It's very rare that you get to actually share everything that you think about, the thing that you're most passionate about. And like I've told many people before, talking about dance is, I think, one of my favorite things in the world. So, some of my first experiences with dance was definitely Bollywood. I think that's actually where the love for the art form began for me. I would oftentimes find myself waking up early in the morning and just switching on like 9XM or MTV and just dancing. No one there in the living room, just me, my favorite Bollywood tracks, and just some space around the house. And I think one of the reasons why I write now about Bollywood while being a classical dancer is that Bollywood was actually where I think my love for dance started. It was simply the joy of moving to music that I think continues to be the reason that I dance even today after several years. So, yeah, I think that's one of my first memories of dance in my childhood.
How interesting is. And do you remember, for most other, art forms, we have a space where we can learn it in a structured sort of setup. For instance, for music, there can be levels you go through. So was there a particular dance form you immediately wanted to gravitate towards? Because in Bollywood films, they don't specify if it is Bharatnatyam or Odissi or Kathak. So which one did you have like a natural inclination towards?
I think it was less a natural inclination and more peer pressure, actually. So when I first started formally training in dance, I was 10. But a year prior to that, my mother, like all Bengali mothers, had put me into a music class. And I absolutely hated the sound of my own voice. A friend of mine was joining, so I was like, okay, at least my friend will be there, so the two of us can go for class together. But I slowly, and not slowly actually, I quickly realized that I absolutely hated it. And that pushed me closer to dance. It was odd because that was around the same time that I'll let the plane pass.
It's good. They'll think it's like an added sound effect.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, that was around the same time that in school I was constantly being picked for like the dance groups during our cultural programs or presentations in school, like our small little, you know, assembly performances or stuff like that. I was constantly being picked for the dance groups, and I was confused because I'm learning music. Why are you not putting me in singing? And then once I went for my singing class, I realized no, actually, I think it's dance that makes my brain sing. Um, so around me, all my friends at the time were learning Odissi. And Bharatnatyam was and still is one of the most common forms to find in Bangalore. Um, and so I didn't want to do what everyone else was doing, but I did want to do what my friends were doing. And so we searched all across the city to search for an Odissi teacher um, for me. And in the area that I live, we couldn't find anyone. And so we found a Kathak teacher instead. And my mother was like, shall we just go for Kathak? I said, yeah, I like it. So might as well. It looks nice. And at the time I was 10. I mean, who's going to actually know what the form really, requires from a dancer? And then last moment, I found my teacher. Just as I was about to join that Kathak class, I found my teacher and I started learning Odissi at the age of 10. Oddly enough, 6 years after that, I started learning Kathak 2 buildings down from my Odissi class. So that one road in Bangalore is essentially where my entire dance training has happened. And I continue to teach there now. So that one area is like where my entire dance world is kind of all concentrated. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like you've already, spent over 17 years in the world of dance, and you're still quite young, so it's a considerable amount of experience in that world. But for someone that doesn't know too much about, dance from a South Asian lens and dance from maybe a Western lens, if you could help me understand, uh, to start off with, maybe in the Indian classical dance traditions, what are the different forms of dance and how are they particularly different from each other in terms of their elements?
So there are 8 Indian classical forms, okay, considered. There is Odissi, Kathak, the 2 that I learned. There's Bharatnatyam, Kuchipudi, Kathakali, Mohiniyattam, Satriya, and who am I forgetting? Who am I forgetting? See, Kathak, Bharatnatyam. I'm forgetting one more. Anyway,
We'll add it in
we'll add
later.
it in.
Yeah.
Right. So there are 8 Indian classical dance forms. Each of them are distinct from each other due to the region that they come from.
Hmm.
Odissi comes from Odisha and is peppered with the context of the space that it comes from. Almost all of these dance forms have either originated in temples or have originated with a connection to the Hindu tradition. Um, Kathak separates itself from the rest because it is considered the only standing form. Every other form is a seated form, meaning you bend your knees and you are in a sort of seated plie sort of a stance. Um, all of them rather, are connected through the Natya Shastra, which is a treatise on dance and drama, an ancient treatise on dance and drama, which essentially uh, codifies movements that are used in all of these forms. Okay. Uh, for example, there is a specific name for when your foot goes from here to here, or a specific name for a mudra like this. Essentially, all of these forms are storytelling forms. They're all made to tell stories. So within Indian classical, we have a difference between storytelling, which is abhinaya, and then you also have pure dance, which is nritta. This pure dance is non-narrative dance, essentially just exploring the physical possibilities of the form. And so each form has its own codified movements, which are region specific, and that is how they separate itself from each other. And also the music of those specific forms is different. For example, in Bharatnatyam, you'll hear a lot of Carnatic music. In Kathak, you'll hear Hindustani music, right? So that's how they all are separate from each other. They're different from Western dance because essentially it's tied very specifically to traditions. It's a part of the Indian lifestyle as opposed to simply an art form presented on a stage. That is how we tend to think of, segregating the two. Yeah.
That was very helpful to understand in terms of breaking down those different forms, Eshna. And the Natya Shastra was one of like the most important sort of books I read as a young student, and I know in that book they spoke about the rasa theory, and in the narrative form of dance that you were saying, I'm curious about, as someone that's done this for such a long time, if you could, help me understand from these old traditions, what was the purpose of dance in terms of how it brought people together as a community? I'd love to know more about that.
So, a lot of these dance forms, I can speak of the ones that I practice the best because each and every dance form has had a specifically different trajectory, different history. Odissi is essentially a combination of several traditions within Orissa. The form itself comes from the Gotipua dance tradition, where young pre-adolescent boys are dressed up as girls and they perform and they do acrobatic movements. And it was essentially like a entertainment, right? Watching little children like flip over each other, do cartwheels is exciting to watch. It is also a mixture of the Mahari tradition. The Mahari tradition is the quote-unquote Devdasi tradition, the tradition of women who are consecrated to the temple and performed specifically for religious rituals, without whom the rituals would not be complete, right? So they dedicated their dance to the Lord. It's also made up of a combination of what is seen on the walls of the temples in Orissa, right? The sculptures on the walls that has been kind of interjected into the form to create what you see today as Odissi. The places that these original sort of like parent art forms, let's call them, the places that these parent art forms took place in were oftentimes places where lots of people came together. It was the way that we go to the theaters now to watch movies is the way that dance was then, right? Including Kathak as well, but Kathak took a little different trajectory because it moved into the Mughal courts. And that is where it kind of flourished as a form, specific as a form. Movement is different, form is different, right? So it specifically flourished as a form within the Mughal courts. And as we have seen in countless films, those performances would often draw a lot of dignified, sophisticated people to the audience. And then watching a dance performance became an entire experience in itself, because you would put attar on yourself, you would have flower garlands around your wrists. In some settings, alcohol would be served. So it was an entire experience by itself. People weren't just going to see technical prowess, they were going for the experience. And so all of these dance forms were essentially places where people would commune to enjoy art, right? in the classical world, we have a problem with the word entertainment. That our art forms are not entertainment. It's art, it's sadhana, it's something that's meditative. It is, but it is also entertainment. The roots, we cannot deny the history, right? It used to be places where people would congregate to watch something and enjoy it. That is art, that is also entertainment. So yeah, all of these forms had, and they continue to be places where people get to congregate and enjoy something together. Although the numbers have come down because, as we know, we have different modes of entertainment and different modes of art to turn to now.
Yeah, because I think about what you say in the context of a world that didn't have the kind of media we have today, right? There was no film, there was even books may have been limited, to particular classes of society. So a performance of that scale would have been the primary way for people to connect with each other in a very intimate social setting. And, um, like in some way, was dance at a particular time used to also talk about social and political causes, or was that something that happened based on the subjective understanding and worldview of each dancer or each school of sort of dance, or is that something that came through in some way over time, or
I'm a bit apprehensive to say that it necessarily reflected the social and political uh, opinions or problems of the time.
yeah.
Reason being, the time that we're talking about was not very documented, right?
Hmm.
Dance research, the essential issue within the field is that if you go back, before the camera,
Yeah.
it's really difficult to actually figure out what was going on. Whether you can even call what was happening in the Mughal courts Kathak is a question in and of itself, right?
Hmm.
Because the form as we see it today may not have been, and I'm saying may not have been the form that was being practiced in the Mughal courts, pre-camera, pre-film, pre-all of that, pre any sort of documentational evidence. We have a lot of sketches that were made during that time, and through that we might be able to assume some things, draw some parallels. But all dance historians, every book that I have read, and I'm still very, very, very new in the field, essentially cite the same thing, right? That it's very difficult to actually draw conclusions. Instead, we are simply looking at different realities that were possible at the time. Coming back to your question about political and uh, environmental things that might have influenced the dancing that was happening at the time, the things that have endured are the pieces themselves, the dance pieces themselves, right? Some, of course, you can sit and figure out, that it dates back to this year or that year or whatever. But oftentimes, what we see on stage today, right? If we're talking about traditional pieces that have passed down from guru to guru, from guru to student, from guru to student, just follow that lineage, we often get the feeling that it's somewhat like an artifact, right? It's something that has been really carefully taken care of through history and brought down and laid before us, whether it has relevance in today's time or not,
Yeah.
right? So, from that, the things that we can deduce is that essentially the context was religious, right? So, it was often the religious um, inklings of the time that spread through, which was the god being most revered at that point in time. That person, you can see that element within the piece. What kind of language was being used? That's something that we can draw in. A lot of pieces, not specifically within the Odissi or the Kathak context, but a lot in the Bharatnatyam context. Some of the pieces were dedicated to the Maharaja of the time, whoever the king was, because they are performing in the court of the king. So we dedicate it to the court of the king, and we talk about how brilliant he is, how strong he is, how valiant he is. So these are the sort of elements that sneak into these um, pieces. And it's so through the pieces that we can understand what was on the minds of the artists at the time. That's one. Second, what are the contexts that they were performing in? That influenced, I think, uh, deduction. This is my deduction. That I think
Yeah.
that influenced their pieces and the dance that they were doing at the time more than simply what they thought about what was happening in the world. I'm unsure about that actually. I might have to read up a lot more to understand that.
No, it's helpful to know that, some of the original sources, because of the lack of documentation, may have not been as widely available, and that may affect the interpretation of it. And you'd also have to consider, like, answering this question in the context of our history as a country and as a subcontinent too, where, you had different eras. And I think the economic part of it can also be an underlying layer in terms of the environments that supported it. And for a long time, the patronage of the arts came from a particular class. And, I think that relationship can also cause a sense of tension, but also be liberating in terms of freeing the artist from working off that. So I feel like you hit on a lot of these points in that sense. But Ishna, I wanted to backtrack a bit to your journey as a student, growing up in Bengaluru. Like, what was that like for you? Like, what were you curious about at school apart from dance? Like, what was Eshna as a
Mm.
student like? And maybe you can tell me a little bit about, the influence of your parents and also your love for movies, while you were on. It's a very open-ended sort of question.
So actually, I think my childhood was the best
Yeah.
because I went to a school which now we have the term for it is an alternative education school. I grew up in a jungle practically where we were climbing trees and picking tamarind and eating wood apple and walking barefoot in the grass, all the things that people ask you to do for your mental health these days. We did it as children. um, but what was interesting about that environment was not just the fact that we were surrounded by nature, but was the fact that uh, my school in many ways really propagated this idea of questioning.
Mm.
We would very often have discussions about anything in the world, really. Our teacher would just come to class with a thought on his mind, share it with us, and we would kind of debate, discuss, disagree, yell, cry, whatever. It was heated discussions that we would have about problems in the world that might not necessarily, concern us, but we felt it was important to talk about it. And that thread continued through also what my parents have taught me. No question was banned in my house. No topic was banned. My father very famously told my mother that if she's old enough to ask the question, she's old enough to know the answer.
Mm.
So I grew up in an environment where this idea of there being rules that you had to follow without questioning was not a concept. And as a result, I had a problem with authority.
Mm.
Um, Not in the sense that I was a bad student. I was a very good student, actually. But I never believed that authority should be respected simply because it's authority.
Mm.
Um, if I thought that that person was deserving of my respect, I would give them that respect, no doubt. And base level decency is, of course, maintained. But that a person is. That I'm not allowed to question that person, that I'm not allowed to question what that person is saying, just simply because of the power they hold within the system. Not a concept for me, which is what I struggled with a lot when I went into my dance class. Oftentimes, in a classical situation, classical dance or music, the guru is the be all and end all of the form for you. You don't question the guru. You don't ask them, why do you think this? Why did this happen? Why should I be doing it this way? You follow. You follow and you take whatever that teacher is giving you as blessings, right? You just try to embody everything that person is giving you. And to an extent, that is important because I feel art requires surrender. It requires you to forget yourself. You are not you when you're dancing. You are whatever you are dancing at that moment. But I found it, and I still struggle with it a lot. Um, Even though I vehemently disagree with this person at this point, how do I simply shut up and take it? How can I just sit there and stay silent even though everything that that person is saying, I believe in none of it. Can I just take their art? Is that possible? Can I separate the art from the artist? I think that debate began for me in the dance class, in my dance classes. But coming back to your point of your question of what was I outside of the classroom, I was very curious all the time. I think as a result of what my school did for me, I came out simply enjoying learning. I think that was one of the essential elements that I was able to take back from my schooling, which is that none still till today, learning is not something that is just about textbooks and mugging. It's about knowledge. It's about knowledge being power. And I think to sum up what I was like in school or what my interests were like in school, I should tell you what my 11th and 12th subjects were. Normally, people take commerce, art, science. My school had a bucket system essentially. So they would put subjects in buckets, and you could pick one subject from each. And my combination during my 11th and 12th was biology, psychology, history, and art. And I still believe that these are the four elements that make up my brain. I find it extremely exciting when two seemingly unrelated fields have tangents running through them. And I'm hoping that through whatever work I do in the next 2 years within the dance research aspect, I'm able to bring these tangential elements together, because I think that is when something as small in the sense of, um, well, interest. There's not a lot of people that are interested in dance. Something as small as dance can really speak volumes about everything else in the world, politically, socially. If you're talking about women empowerment, you're talking about representation, you're talking about caste, you're talking about history. That one moment on stage, I feel, encapsulates all of these various elements. And I think that understanding came about through whatever I had done in school, through whatever my parents had taught me, that there are no boundaries to any of what you're learning. So yeah.
I love that, and that's such a rare combination, the ability to choose those four disciplines, because I remember growing up in an environment where our path was primarily either science, commerce, or the arts. And subconsciously, in a way, we had this hierarchy where most children were encouraged in my setup to go towards the sciences, and you would choose the commerce or arts if you weren't really sure. And even when you chose those paths, you somehow knew that you were choosing it to go down a particular line. So engineering, accountancy, and maybe law were the paths that were admired. And I feel like children are very good at picking up subconscious sort of understandings and ways of looking at the world. So I think it was a real battle for me at a personal level to understand this growing up, and I'm curious, like, how did those subjects and that sort of high school education influence your thinking when you decided to choose something for your undergraduate studies? Like, what did you eventually decide to study? And, maybe you can tell me a little bit about what that experience was like for you as well, Eshna.
So essentially, I came out with this combination. I came out with school confused.
Okay. So, Ishna, like I wanted to ask you about your decision of what you decided to study at university and why you chose those particular subjects, and maybe what that experience was like for you as a student.
So actually, as soon as I came out of school with that amazing combination of four subjects, I was, as a result of it, completely confused as to what I should be studying, because I loved all four subjects. I loved art, I loved biology, I loved psychology, I loved history. So I applied for all. I applied in various different universities for each of these subjects. Um, and I finally decided to go with the one that I felt at the time challenged me the most, which was film. So my bachelor's is in film, and I studied here in Bangalore at Srishti. Um, the course was a 4-year course, essentially, with the first year being sort of a foundational course that just introduced students to all sorts of art. Um, and the next 3 years were specialized in filmmaking. We didn't specialize within a certain department. We kind of did a broad spectrum thing on filmmaking as a whole. Those 4 years, I think, were foundational in uh, building my creative process. Not only building my creative process, but also figuring out what really makes me tick, what really works for me. When I'm uh, burnt out, what do I do? When I have no ideas, what do I do? It kind of set me up for the next few years, which I feel a lot of people who come to art come after having done other things. But here I was diving straight into the field, into the creative field, without any other sort of a background, right? I think that gives a sense of a very deep intimacy with the creative process. That now, I think, while I have been freelancing by myself or creating any of these platforms, whether it's my YouTube or the Deep Cut, has really helped me. Um, I chose film essentially because I really liked photography in school. Um, I really liked handling the camera. Being in front or behind it was great for me. Um, and so I went into film really on a whim, actually. I think it takes a lot of privilege to be able to say that, but I really did go in on a whim and absolutely fell in love with it. I felt like I understood editing because of my dance, because I understood rhythm. I understood sound design for the same reason. I could see rhythm in whether it was directing an actor or writing a script. And I think only in my last year, in my fourth year, that I realized that it was either writing or editing. One of those two departments was where I would like to focus all my energy, because plotting out the pace of a story, or plotting out the pace of an edit, essentially either creating the building blocks of the story or finishing the building blocks of a story. Both of those parts of the filmmaking process it felt both challenging and also fascinating to me. And so that's how I kind of went into the subject. And of course, my teachers exposed us to world cinema. We were able to watch everything from Rang De Basanti to Eisenstein's Odessa Steps to Mege Dhaka Tara to, we were watching films from all across the world, and that of course opened up our eyes to different ways of telling stories. And essentially, I think my interest boils down to simply that: how do we tell a story effectively, whatever the medium may be: filmmaking, dance, writing, all of it.
Yeah, because when I think about filmmaking as a form, I feel like it's a little challenging because there are so many people involved in bringing that project to life. And very often, you see the actors, telling the story, but there are the editors, the directors. I think it's such a massive enterprise, and I always wonder, like, at some point, do these artists wonder about the story that they're telling? Will this story actually reach the audience the way? And sometimes, the other people involved in the project may not have that much of a say. For instance, the director is the person controlling the visions, but the editors or the set designers may not have as much of a say in terms of the story. So um, in terms of the films that impacted you over time, Eshna, like off the top of your head, I know both of us have a couple of films that we, particularly enjoy, but if you could tell me maybe three or four films, if we could focus on maybe the Indian film industry, not just the Hindi film industry, but Malayalam cinema, Tamil, like three or four films that stood out for you. And as a filmmaking student, if you could tell me one or two things about that story that really stayed with you, that would be a nice discussion to have.
I think, of course, our common interest, Piku, has always stayed with me. It's one of those films that I think when you study as a film student, you kind of split your brain into two. There's one side of appreciating cinema as a film student. Wow, the pacing of this script was so good, the editing was so good, the cinematography was so good. And then there's a side that you're just drawn to without any meaning, just pure emotion. And I think Piku is one of those films that I'm drawn to with pure emotion. I have no sense of what I do as a film. It's actually a very roughly made film. If you see the lighting, if you see the camera work, it's quite jarring at some points. The edit cuts at some points. It jumps at some points. However, I think that's what's fascinating about storytelling. If you focus so much on the story, the telling of it, through the actors, the dialogues, and the pacing, you're going to sell it.
Yeah.
And it got sold to me through that pure emotion, that it was something as simple as this relationship between our daughter and her father. And because their characters were so strong, so you cannot ignore them, that it just draws you in. You see, for me, Piku became the film where I saw Deepika Padukone as both me, my mother, my grandmother, all of the women in my family who have taken care of someone or the other. And Amitabh Bachchan's character became my grandmother, my grandfather, all the old people in my life. And I think that's why that film was so powerful. It's because I think everyone saw some part of their own lives within the characters in the film. Second, what actually I'm not so sure. There's one film that isn't an Indian film though that comes
That's
to mind.
okay. We can go wherever. Yeah.
It's called Blue Mountains. It's if I'm not wrong, it's a Georgian film. And it's essentially about a man trying to get his book published during USSR, essentially.
Yeah.
And it is a dark comedy where this man goes through several trials to get this book published, until at the end, after everything is gone through, the publishing house, the building of it collapses. Right? So I think that film opened me up to what script writing could be. What kind of pacing, what kind of world building you can create to create a crescendo so high that when the simple act of a building breaking down makes you begin to laugh, but also think of the trials and tribulations that this person has gone through. I think that film still stays in my mind whenever I'm writing something, whenever, especially if it's fiction, because it also uses familiar things like motifs, like red herrings, writing tools that we've all learnt about in probably our literature class, but haven't really applied ourselves or seen it.
Yeah.
Seeing it on screen, I think, changes the way we understand writing, understand pacing, understand story. So that was one of the films that did that for me.
Yeah, I think these are two good examples, and I'm curious about like storytelling traditions, in the West, like if you go back to Aristotle's Poetics, the story structure is going back to that structure of the tragedy, and that coming through. But if you look at other storytelling traditions around the world, you don't really have the hero's myth sort of narrative come through, and I feel like watching films from different countries helped me realize that there's not always a monomyth coming through in these stories. And And I find that really fascinating, especially in an Indian context, because I've noticed storytelling traditions shift in each state, where the way Malayali cinema tells stories or the way Bengali cinema tells stories is so different. And I think it's more a textural thing, but it's also very rooted in a particular region. And and this is just like I'm actually from Karnataka, and I'm from like the coast, and we have this sort of myth making tradition where we pray to a particular deity, and we believe that this deity is present in our forests. It protects us from the good and bad. So for some reason, in that part of like my ancestral village, no one is really scared of going out in the night because they know that someone's protecting them. So I'm just really intrigued by these storytelling traditions. And do you, as an artist, see some of that as you are watching these movies, Eshna?
I think it's interesting because what you're saying takes me back to something my scriptwriting teacher had said in class. I think we had just watched Meghe Dhaka Tara and he expected us to cry.
Mm.
And we said this didn't work for us emotionally. He said, okay, let me try something a little more contemporary. And he gave us Rang De Basanti.
Mm.
And he essentially highlighted one point. And he said, you can and at the end of that class is when we had watched Rang De Basanti. But prior to all of this, we had watched Spanish cinema, we'd watched Blue Mountains, we'd watched various films from across the world, which had their own, like you said, unique stamp of where they came from, their own context, right? And he said, whether you guys like it or not, melodrama is in your blood.
Mm.
We're Indians.
Yeah.
Melodrama is in our blood. It will come out when you write. It will come out in different textures when you write. We unfortunately will probably never be able to make a film the way a British person makes it or an American makes it, but we'll make it uniquely ours.
Yeah.
And melodrama is one of those tools that we use. Which takes me back to another point of this scriptwriting book that I was reading. It's called The Art of Dramatic Writing. I think I will pronounce his name wrong, I feel, but it's by Lejos Egri, I think. And it says what he writes about theater scripts, right? But in the first chapter, he talks about the idea of a premise. A premise is actually the same world over. Rags to riches, or whatever, you go from unlucky to lucky. All of these are just premises that the world uses. Every film will be, every good film, you should be able to boil down to a single lined premise. However, what makes it fascinating is when you change the context. There is no one idea, there's no original idea in the world, but there are multiple contexts, and that is when an original idea emerges.
Mm.
The premise remains the same, but that same rags to riches premise placed in maybe in a slum in Dharavi changes, right? You get Gully Boy, for example, right? So I think these are a few tools that I think are not tied to a medium. I think it jumps mediums. Film shows it to us. Books make us read it, and I think dance, we embody it.
Yeah.
I think that's just the difference in the medium, but the tools for an effective story, I think, remain the same.
No, I love that because when I'm hearing you speak, I realize in some way that the local in some way eventually becomes the universal, and I think it's and that's what I'm trying to challenge. I'm not trying to challenge, like when I like something, I think there must be other movies that are so similar to this, so let's find these other movies. But it's so local and so true to that particular context that which is why I've not been able to find another Piku like film, because that texture of that relationship is so unique to that time. But Ishna, I wanted to ask you about your creative projects, and I love how you have not limited yourself and you've used technology really creatively too, whether it's your YouTube channel, and I know you were considering like a podcast at some time, and then even Deep Cut, which is your Substack. So if you could just take us through your journey post your university years of how you were exploring, these creative projects in addition to your work as a dancer. You've consistently practiced that, but YouTube, your podcast, and your writing. If you could tell me about that.
So essentially, all of these creative projects were a result of conflict. I started my YouTube channel while I was still in college because I was feeling completely creatively drained by whatever we were doing in class. It was not exciting to me, not stimulating. It felt repetitive. I felt limited, and I had so much more to say. I felt like the conversations weren't stimulating with my peers, with the teachers. There was something amiss. Um, I later realized that amiss thing was my own mind, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Um, and so I started making YouTube videos to essentially just have conversation, chit chat and charcha, which eventually turned into a sort of podcast like format. A sort of small series within that big YouTube channel was one of the first things that I started, simply to have conversation about interesting topics with my friends. That's all I thought about. And then chit chat and charcha slowly developed into Lights, Camera, Action, I think, which was a small, very tiny series that I did with my film friends about film students talking about different aspects of cinema. Essentially, that was the hook. And of course, we started, because I have so many varied interests, I started to explore, book reviews and film reviews and vlogs and, of course, dance videos. And making all of this taught me different skill sets. I would often shoot all the dance videos entirely by myself. Lighting is mine, costume is mine, choreography is mine, camera is mine, editing is mine, sound is mine, and that made me extremely self-reliant. I would also get extremely exhausted by the end of it, but it was very, very meaningful to me. Of course, I think now I've tried multiple times over the last few years to revive that YouTube channel, but I think I've outgrown it in some way, shape, or form. Maybe later I'll come back to it. But through the YouTube channel, my editing got better. It's through that YouTube channel that I started getting editing jobs after I finished university. It's through that I figured out, well, Premiere Pro. No one taught us the software like that. So I figured out the software because I was essentially playing. And so a lot of these creative projects were places for me to play. And I think that was an essential part of me building anything. Deep Cut, of course, is my second Substack actually. I have one personal Substack called Mahila Profound, which is still active. And I essentially just those are like, if I travel somewhere, I post some travelogues. If I'm thinking about something, I post those thoughts. It's more of just a personal get to know me sort of newsletter. I don't really promote it that much. It's just more of an outlet for me, and whoever reads it. I don't think about it. But I was struggling with that. I was really struggling with that first newsletter because I was like, what do I write about? I want to write. I so desperately want to write. But what do I know well enough to actually write about? This was during the pandemic when all I had were really my own thoughts in these machines. Couldn't go out anywhere. Whatever work I was doing was over here. I was working with people, but not working with people. I was just emailing them, not meeting them. So at that point in time, I think I wrote a film review for one of my friends, I think. And then it just struck me. Why have you not been writing about films? You enjoyed it so much in college. And even in college, while we were all trying to figure out we had to do like a compulsory internship. While we were all trying to figure out internships, people were going on sets and, people were going on the post-production, pre-production. I wanted to go into film journalism. I was searching for a an internship in film journalism. I didn't get it. That's a different matter. And so that suddenly struck me. Okay, let's write. Let's write about films. And so the newsletter began as a place for me to essentially write about films. And then my brain went, 1 second. That's not your passion. Come back. Um, and then we arrived at this extremely niche but so exciting area of dance in cinema. And yeah, like you put in your introduction as well, it's now what I'm going to be studying properly, formally. And that's extremely exciting to me. So yeah.
And I think that's what stayed with me about your newsletter, Eshna, is that I didn't know about your background, but when I read the initial pieces, it's the amount of detail that you were able to capture about a particular, whether, I know you have a deep passion for Aishwarya Rai and Madhuri Dixit and the way they bring their characters to life. But I think after reading your pieces, I actually went and saw the videos, whether it was looking at Aishwarya Rai in her performance for Devdas and then looking at her performance in Dhoom 2. And I'm like, how can the same person do these two songs? These are two completely different contexts, and it made me appreciate her as an artist so much more because the emotions, the story are so different, but it's also the body language, the costumes, the life context of that character. So, and then there was this piece where I think you were collaborating with another writer where you spoke about the item number and the geographic sort of landscape. So I love how you are able to take out, you know, you're not just looking at dance. I feel like your pieces intersect with dance and geography, dance and history, dance and psychology. And I think it goes back to your initial passion of bringing those, worlds together. But if you could tell me, just for the last question, just to respect time as well, Ishna, like about one piece and how it came together in your mind, and what does that look like for you as a writer as well?
I think it's interesting that you pointed out these tangents because initially when I started writing, it was just fangirling, right? About these dance pieces that I've been watching, like I said, coming back right to the beginning from my childhood, right? Switch on MTV and you see Aishwarya Rai in Kachrare, or Madhuri in Devdas, and you're just completely glued to the screen. Why are you so glued to the screen? So the first question was just trying to figure out, how to appreciate these pieces. I think that was my first challenge. How to look at something deeper, something more meaningful. But then the question that I struggled with while writing more and more pieces was why. Why is this important? How does it matter whether Madhuri has done this on screen or Aishwarya has done that on screen? Why does dance matter in a film? And then why does dance in a film matter to the world? And I think that's where the tangents come in. So I think one of the recent pieces that I wrote was Dance and the Rain, essentially. And it came very randomly because it was pouring in Bangalore for like 3 weeks continuously. I didn't have any motivation to write. The rain was keeping my spirits dampened. And then I just thought, 1 second, rain dances, why not? And so then the piece became drawing these tangents, not just between dance and rain, but also between Bollywood and classical dance, and how rain has remained a constant. It's a constant mood maker, whether it's a mood of relief, whether it's a mood of longing, whether it's a mood of just fun. You just want to get out and feel free in the rain. Um, so how then does dance become the thread to link all of these emotions? But also how interesting that the dance that classical dancers feel is a bit, we don't want to go there, Bollywood, is essentially mimicking the same emotion that classical dancers are presenting on screen.
Yeah.
Like we said, the medium is different, the texture is different, but it's the same story that clicks. So that piece became sort of one a breaker for that creative block that the rain had given me, but also became, I think, a very, like, I feel like I've just dipped my toes in this idea of drawing all of these tangents, and it's getting me more and more excited as to what next.
Yeah, and I think that's like a note, we can, I know this conversation, went up and down, but I feel like once you read Eshna's pieces, the reason uh, I hope you come to this conversation is because you're curious about, dance, but I highly recommend following this conversation up with, uh, looking through the archives of Deep Cut. I did that this past week, and there are so many pieces. And I am not a dancer myself, and I don't even know Eshna. I mean, this is like the first time we're actually speaking, but I think as you will start to appreciate and see sides of dance that you may have never ever seen before. And I think the connections to so many other parallel layers of your life come through in, her wonderful pieces. So Ishna, thank you for making time for this. I hope we
Thank
get
you.
to do like a second part maybe in the coming time, maybe on your dance research in particular, because I feel like that will really take you into the deepest parts of this world. And I hope some of those experiences come through in your Substack. So as a reader and a fan, we will be waiting for that too.
Most definitely. Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. And yeah, I sincerely hope that at least through this, more people get interested in dance, sit in dance shows, or um, watch Dance India dance with a renewed perspective, watch Aishwarya on screen with a renewed perspective, and watch us on stage with a renewed perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ishna. And on that note, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories.